It is in such little retired Dutch valleys, Washington Irving wrote at the beginning of the 19th century, found here and there embosomed in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. Thus Irving, along with his contemporaries, James Kirk Paulding and James Fenimore Cooper, popularized during the first decades of the 19th century a romantic literary vision of a bucolic Dutch culture slumbering in niches along the shores of the Hudson and Raritan River valleys. Although the culture so charmingly stereotyped by these writers was a product of the initial European settlement of the region by the Dutch Republic 2 centuries earlier, it was not static. Rather, the culture they wrote of was the result of a long evolutionary development. Indeed, the golden age of Dutch culture in New York and New Jersey lay not during its 4 decades under Dutch administration, but in the 18th century when the region was under English rule. Let's see if I get the... There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. The reasons for Dutch cultural tenacity in New York and New Jersey are complex. With an official Dutch presence in North America lasting a mere 40 years, from 1624 until 1664, with an interregnum of 15 months in 1673-1674. Moreover, the ethnic Dutch never formed a majority of the population, even in the Dutch colonial period. Nonetheless, a Dutch imprint is found in place names and political geography of the region and in cultural patterns that persist into the 21st century. Dutch political traditions, particularly its guarantee of freedom of conscience and concepts of republican government, came to influence the wider development of American political theory. The seeds of America's modern party system had its origins in Dutch political disputes, and 17th century Dutch culture left a lasting impress in regional folklore, language, religion, cuisine, and material culture that eventually found their way into mainstream American culture. The most noticeable legacy of the Dutch is in the political geography of the Mid-Atlantic. At the time, the Dutch West India Company Director General Petrus Stuyvesant surrendered Manhattan to an English invasion force in September 1664. New Netherland contained about 9,000 inhabitants, with 2 major towns, New Amsterdam, New York City, and Beverwijk, Albany, 16 villages, and a scattering of smaller settlements over a vast territory extending from the Delaware to the Connecticut River and northward into the Mohawk River Valley. The change in regimes was not catastrophic for most of the inhabitants. The terms of capitulation guaranteed the Dutch their customary rights of property, inheritance, and religious practice. Through the widespread influence of Dutch cartographers, Dutch place names such as Staten Island, Bergen, Barnegat, named in 1614 Barendregat, or Island of the Breakers, Dunderhook, and Paulushoek have become widely accepted. Residents continue to view their spatial environment through Dutch eyes long after 1664. The English guarantee to the Dutch of their property and inheritance rights, and in repatenting of their town charters, confirmed that the Dutch political geography would remain in place. Among the attributes the Dutch had established in North America were traditions of diversity and localism. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic was not a commonwealth, but, as English diplomat Sir William Temple noted in 1672, a confederacy of 7 sovereign provinces united together for their common and mutual defense without any dependence one upon the other. Cultural, commercial, nor ethnic unity bound the provinces together as much as their successful rebellion against the Spanish Habsburgs and resulting federation for military protection. Ethnic diversity was a key attribute of the Republic. The impressive economic growth of the cities of the western provinces of Holland and Zeeland drew enormous numbers of immigrants. By 1625, 1/3 of Amsterdam's population was of foreign derivation. More English immigrated to Holland than to New England. The result was that an ethnically diverse commercial interests dominated the cities and their overseas enterprises. The Dutch West India Company's settlement of New Netherland reflected this heterogeneity. By the time of the English conquest, New Netherland contained an ethnically diverse population that created a complex, if not always harmonious, patchwork of coexisting communities. As historian Alice Kenny wrote, the foundation for this unity was an unspoken agreement shared by the Dutch people to respect each other, the same loyalty to communal privileges and local customs that they claimed for themselves. In the Netherlands, towns dominated the countryside and merchant oligarchies dominated the towns. The Dutch brought with them this tradition of urban culture. The West India Company's grant of local governing rights to Beverwijk, Albany, in 1652, municipal rights to New Amsterdam, New York City, in 1653, as well as various village charters, resulted in the recreation of a familiar society. As a result, New Netherland became unique among the American colonies for having 2 competing urban centers dominating their hinterlands. Under the English, the cities retained their Dutch forms of government, with no new changes immediately introduced into the political administration except for the adoption of English titles for public offices: mayor for burgemeester, sheriff for schout, and alderman for schepen. Because the English allowed the Dutch in New York to retain their customs, and as London's imperial administration remained distant, the transition from Dutch to English culture was gradual. Although the region's urban culture, I think something happened to the slides here. There we go. Although the region's urban culture flourished with incorporation into England's mercantile world, it flourished in Dutch fashion. As new communities became established and matured, they also maintained an independent corporate identity along the lines of early modern European Dutch towns. This is most evident in the lack of province-wide cooperation and in shifting loyalties during periods of political crisis. When in 1664, the threat of English invasion was imminent, Director Stuyvesant's attempt to get the communities to unite for their defense was met with, quote, a general discontent and unwillingness to assist in defending the place. After the 1673 Dutch recapture of New York, Dutch Governor Anthony Colve frequently arbitrated between contentious communities. Thomas S. Wearmouth writes that 18th century Hudson River Valley communities, quote, had relatively few reservations about using their power to protect their corporate standing, whether from outsiders or, more routinely, to maintain the social order within the community. The land-grant policies of James as Duke and King ironically reinforced the Dutchness of the region's political geography. In the Netherlands, multiple jurisdictions overlapped between provinces, towns, and manorial estates. James's establishment of counties in 1683 and manors with political privileges followed a pattern familiar to the Republic's political division into duchies, counties, and lordships. The latter, a jurisdictional form introduced into New Netherland with the patroonship in 1629, but had, with the exception of Rensselaer, ultimately failed prior to 1664. The larger these the larger of these manorial patents included Rensselaer, established in 1629 and repatented in 1685, Livingston Manor, Philipsburg Manor, and Cortland Manor. These grants, which gave their owners jurisdictional rights within their properties, concentrated much of the best arable land in the hands of a few mercantile families who, in Dutch regent fashion, derived their wealth from trade and continued to maintain their primary residences in the urban centers. Outside towns and manorial holdings, the English conquest had little impact on rural communities except for the requirement that farmers secure new land patents. The English crown left a considerable autonomy to New York's villages and farming hamlets, a situation similar to that in the Republic where government was decentralized. The Duke's Laws of 1665, written originally for New York's English communities, only gradually expanded province-wide. Moreover, it contained a number of Dutch features. Among these was toleration in leaving religious character up to the community and plural nomination and partial retirement in public office. The imposition of the English form of town government in the Hudson Valley after 1675 thus did not represent a complete break with Dutch traditions. As late as the American Revolution, villages in the Hudson River Valley were said to follow, quote, modes peculiar to the Hollanders. The consequence was a tangled web of governments, traditions, and jurisdictions which, as in the Republic, complicated decision-making and resulted in a tradition of intercommunal rivalry that persists to today. Scholars of North American culture areas amply demonstrate that the Dutch in the Hudson and River and Mohawk valleys on western Long Island and in New Jersey formed a key cultural area in pre-industrial America. But what exactly is meant by a Dutch culture in America? In his masterful history on New Netherland, Jaap Jacobs suggests that the culture of the Dutch under English rule was cut off from Patria and went its own way. There is no doubt that there was cultural variations between New Jersey, Long Island, and the Hudson and Mohawk valleys. Yet, as noted above, Netherlandic traditions continue to inform these variations. While the spoken Dutch language in New York and New Jersey was, by 1689, as different as from the Dutch of 1614, and rapidly evolving into de taal, with its regional dialects known as Albany and Jersey Dutch, evidence suggests that all New Yorkers continued to look to the Republic's urban centers, notably Amsterdam and Rotterdam, for news, fashion, and ideas for generations after the English conquest. The American Dutch communities, whether trading or agricultural, were founded as part of the commercial expansion and the Republic's stockholders at the beginning of the 17th century. And it was within this commercial world that they developed. Flourishing trade, both legal and illegal, continued between Holland, the Dutch West Indies, and New York long after 1664, despite England's attempts to restrict it with various navigation acts. After 1675, the major change in New York Netherlands trade is that the city of Rotterdam supplanted Amsterdam as the major Dutch port for New York merchants. Nonetheless, as late as 1756, when the British Parliament passed an act to stem the flow of smuggled goods on Dutch vessels into America, it created a crisis among New York City merchants. While New York imports of Dutch manufactured goods declined throughout the 18th century in relation to the import of English manufactured goods, Dutch exporters adjusted to the transition by developing new markets for such products as paper and gin. As a result, New York merchants carried on continuous contact with Dutch metropolitan centers throughout the colonial period. The Dutch Reformed Church, as defined by the 1619 Synod of Dordrecht, and which remained under the auspices of the Classis of Amsterdam until 1754, is seen as a central institution in maintaining Dutch identity. What is particularly surprising in the post-conquest period, however, is the rapid growth of that denomination among all ethnic groups. Whereas at the time of the English takeover of New Netherland in 1664, only 3 Dutch Reformed dominies oversaw 11 congregations. By 1780, and despite the Anglican Church's favored position after 1693, the number of Dutch Reformed congregations in the Middle Colony soared to 127. Because the Reformed Church was the central and often the only public institution in many communities, its influence was much wider than simply among its communicants. Reformed theology provided a common bond and ideological framework for the colonists. The 1764 call by the New York City Dutch Reformed Church of Archibald Laidlie, who preached in English as well as in Dutch, is often cited as an indicator of the decline of the Dutch culture in the Middle Colonies. Laidlie's call, however, resulted in widespread protests and appeals to public authorities. Although the pro-Dutch language party eventually lost in New York City, it was not until 1787 that the Long Island Reformed Consistory called a dominie who could preach in English. The switch to English was even slower in rural areas. Martinus Schoenmaker, for example, continued to conduct his Midwood, Long Island services slowly in Dutch until his death in 1824, while the last Dutch service in Tappan, New York was in 1835. The Reformed Church's use of Dutch reinforced the use of Dutch as the primary language in private affairs. So pervasive was the use of Dutch in 18th century New York and New Jersey that in 1730, New York City printer William Bradford was compelled to publish a Dutch-English dictionary, quote, whereby the Low Dutch inhabitants of North America may, in a short time, learn to spell, read, understand, and speak proper English, and the English may also learn to spell, read, understand, and write Low Dutch. As late as 1866, the wife of the Dutch Consul General to New York City noted, quote, "It is a fact that 1 out of 10 people in the city will be able to understand you, although it is not our civilized Dutch that they speak." Dutch courants, literally newspapers, and Mercuriuses, somewhat akin to news magazines, circulated in the region well into the 18th century. Such writings, historian William Freihoff writes, testifies not so much to the intensity or the frequency of communications across the oceans as to a sense of a community founded on a common language, a common religion, and a common culture. The result was a widespread bonding between New Yorkers and the Netherlands. As New Jersey State Governor William Livingston wrote to Baron van de Capellen in the Netherlands in 1778, quote, "From my affection for het Vaderland, political considerations apart, I could wish for a friendly connection between the old and the new Netherlands, being by parentage at least 3/4 of a Dutchman myself." The influence of the Dutch language on the dialect of the Mid-Atlantic is still found, according to Dutch scholar Hendrik Edelman, in the distinctive New York and New Jersey accents, as well as in words and phrases peculiar to our region. The oft ridiculed New York pronunciation of Long Island with a harsh G, Long Island, is one such example. H.L. Mencken wrote in the American Language in 1921, "Jersey or Bergen County Dutch is spoken by the descendants of 17th century Dutch settlers in Bergen, Passaic counties, New Jersey. In New York, as everyone knows, Dutch completely disappeared many years ago. But in these Jersey counties, it still survives, though apparently obsolescent, and is spoken by many persons who are not of Dutch blood, including a few Negroes." A large number of regional words and phrases are based on Dutch origins. Cranky, kill for creek, stoop, hook, a point of land, and scow are a few among them. Others, such as cruller, coleslaw, cookie, pancake, pit, as in peach pit, waffle, boss, and Santa Claus, have made their way into standard American English. Customs brought to New Netherland by the Dutch also remained entrenched in the Mid-Atlantic region. Gifts of silver spoon to commemorate the birth of a child, and of a spoon rack as a wedding gift are two. Other such Dutch customs merged with those of other nationalities to create distinctly American holidays. St. Martin's Eve, or Beggar's Day, is one such, when on the 11th of November, children went from house to house wearing masks and carrying lanterns while begging for gifts of sweets and fruit, eventually merged with the Irish Celtic celebration of All Saints' Eve into the modern American Halloween. More commonly known is the creation of the American Christmas carrot of Santa Claus from the Dutch legend of Sinterklaas. Pancakes, waffles, bread with butter, pretzels, cookies, whole grains with milk for breakfast, and coleslaw are also among the foods the Dutch introduced that have become American mainstays. Few material objects, however, more aptly express the survival of Dutch culture than the vernacular architecture. In 1744, Dr. Alexander Hamilton of Annapolis, Maryland, found the houses of New York City, quote, compact and regular, and in general higher built, most of them after the Dutch model, with their gable ends fronting the street. Swiss nationalist Peter Kalm noted in 1749 that most of the houses of Albany are, quote, built in the old way with a gable end towards the street. Richard Smith in 1769 found the buildings of Schenectady in the old Dutch taste. Architectural historians note that the bent system, two principal posts connected by a girder or a beam, is a defining characteristic of New World Dutch vernacular architecture, and despite variations in building materials and changing architectural tastes, is found throughout the region until the development of the balloon frame in the mid-19th century. High ceilings on the first stories of buildings, sometimes 10 to 12 feet, and large windows are another characteristic. While Netherlandic architectural features once common throughout the region, such as cupboard beds, jambless fireplaces, wall anchors, and brick tumbling disappeared in the early 19th century, the basic underlying structure remained based on Dutch prototypes. Moreover, architectural historians are now debating if the changeover to more modern styles in 18th century New York were not also directly derived from the Netherlands. For example, beginning in the 1680s, architects in the Republic were the first to widely accept the use of the sash window, and that Georgian-style architecture appeared in new constructions in the 1660s. Excuse me. By the late 17th century, according to architectural historian Juliet Rodin, Dutch and English architecture was virtually indistinguishable because both the Dutch and English architects of the period to a great extent used the same architectural treaties and visual models. In the Dutch Republic, ancient privileges and traditional liberties acquired by communities as corporate rights resulted in decentralization and factionalism. The settlers brought these traditions with them. It is most evident in New Yorkers and Jerseyites' opposition to governmental centralizing tendencies and jealous guarding of the prerogatives granted to them in their town charters. The colonial competition between Albany and Schenectady over the fur trade monopoly, between New York City and Albany over the export trade monopoly, and between New York City and upriver communities over the flower bolting monopoly are a few such examples. Monopolies were favored when they contributed to the order and stability of the community as a whole. Opposition to monopolies arose when they were found to benefit an individual at the expense of the community. Individual rights were tied to the corporate welfare of the community and manifested in the concept of toleration. The paradoxical nature of rural New York and New Jersey, of being simultaneously insular and parochial while socially tolerant, is a legacy of the Dutch that continues to set the region apart. Within New York's communities, special interest groups coalesced in Dutch fashion to pursue common goals. Individual rights were defended through communal privilege. The medieval Dutch guilds, for example, regulated and promoted specific craft interests within the community. Although the guild system never fully developed in New Netherland, beginning in the 1670s, New York's bakers, boatmen, butchers, cartmen, coopers, shoemakers, and tanners combined to protect their collective rights. Special interests thus became a fixture in 18th century New York politics, which, because of the localized concerns of each interest group, fractured the promotion of a larger province-wide interest before the English crown. Another legacy of the Dutch is the concept of freedom of conscience as a component of a healthy society. In the Dutch Republic, freedom of conscience was enshrined in the 1579 Union of Utrecht, which grew to be seen as the Republic's basic constitutional document. It's the document on the right. Article 13 of the Union specifically states, each person shall remain free, especially in his religion, and that no one shall be persecuted or investigated because of their religion. Although this guarantee applied only to private beliefs and not to public worship, its embodiment as a cornerstone in the foundation of their state makes the Dutch truly unique. The traditional liberties that the Dutch brought to the New World were incorporated into the institutions they introduced. In early modern Holland, where towns dominated the countryside, the surest avenue to property ownership and its attendant prestige was through mercantile pursuits. In 1679, Dutch traveler Jasper Dankerts noted that New Yorkers seemed to be almost all traders. As an individual acquired wealth through trade, he was elevated in the community's standing. An indication of the status of merchants is in their prominence as church elders and deacons, and in their appointments as magistrates and to positions of militia commands. The result was the emergence of a middle class, burgerlijk, urban patrician culture that gained social and political hegemony after 1664. This followed the pattern of the Dutch Republic, where a small group of related regent families controlled civic offices. Also echoing the Republic's regent class, factionalism emerged out of conflicts within the close-knit kinship networks. As Dutch factional leaders often did, New York's political leaders emerged out of a network in which cousins, brothers, and in-laws vied for public opinion and royal favor. In the 17th century, the Republic's body politic split into two factions. On one side were the supporters of the office of Raadpensionaris, the principal representative of the town regents, loosely identified as the Staatsfactie. Opposing them were the Orangists, supporters of the office of Stadtholder, or provincial military commander-in-chief, traditionally held by a Prince of Orange. New York's political factions echo these divisions. In their protracted political disputes, political interests in the Republic and America aligned with theology. In the Netherlands, Staatsgezind and Orangists took opposing sides in the doctrinal conflict between the followers. Go back here. Between the followers of Utrecht University professor Gisbertus Voorhees, who stressed moral precision and the need for a personal conversion to Christ, and the followers of Leiden University professor Johannes Coxius, who espoused a more liberal covenant theology. In this dispute, Orangists allied with Futsians, while the Staatsfactie allied with Coxians. By the last third of the century, this controversy colored every aspect of the Republic's political life and provided the ideological glue for factional disputes in colonial New York. The 1676 controversy over Nicholas van Rensselaer again, there we go, is illustrative. James, Duke of York, had appointed Van Rensselaer, ordained an Anglican, to the Albany Reformed pulpit. The Duke's act outraged the Dutch, who held to the rule from the Synod of Dordrecht that a minister must be ordained in the Reformed Church and called by the congregation. The controversy came to a head when Jacob Leisler, a New York City Reformed Church deacon, circulated a 4-point gloss criticizing a sermon by Van Rensselaer on original sin. The theological dispute, which followed current doctrinal divisions in the Republic's Reformed Church, nearly tore the colony apart until brought to an end at the governor's command. Tensions reemerged in the 1680s when Footsian-inspired pietistic movements swept New York and New Jersey's Reformed congregations, despite opposition by the province's more urbane ministers. Factional rivalries increased as the Duke of York, now King James II, implemented centralizing governmental policies and patronized a small group of merchants with offices and other perquisites. Orangist populist and anti-republican ideology emanating from the Republic, from Rotterdam, now the primary focus for New York's continental trade, further inflamed the population. Paralleling popular support for the House of Orange in the Netherlands, Orangism and anti-Catholicism became a rallying cry for New York's opposition to Stuart policies. The 1689 event, known as Leisler's Rebellion, highlights the continuing influence of the Dutch political culture. In November 1688, William, Prince of Orange, Stadtholder of Holland and Zeeland, and son-in-law and nephew of England's King James II, invaded England with a force of 21,000 men. The subsequent Glorious Revolution, which replaced the Roman Catholic King James with the Protestant William III and his wife, James's daughter Mary, on the English throne, set off rebellions in the American colonies. Revolt in New York broke out at the beginning of May 1689 on Long Island's East End, when the English towns of Suffolk County, following Boston's example, overthrew James II's government. Rebellion spread across Long Island into New Jersey and up the Hudson River, where mobs ousted James's appointees and elected others to replace them. In pattern, however, the New York and East Jersey uprisings bear similarities to the 1672 Orangist uprisings in the Netherlands, where mobs forced numerous towns to replace their magistrates with Footsian Orangists. The Dutch nature of the New York uprising is most evident in the central role taken by the militias. A peculiar characteristic of colonial New York was the prominence in public affairs of local militias. In the Low Country, citizens' militias, the Schutterijen, traditionally played a pivotal role in civic life. Civilian military units created in the Middle Ages to maintain order within towns and employed in military tasks outside city walls in times of crisis increasingly acquired under Republic a more ceremonial role and active political capacity as the guardians of traditional liberties. In similar fashion, the New York militias served a potent political role. Indeed, the English mocked the New York militia companies as a burlesque of militarism. Yet, attempts by English governors to diminish their autonomy through the appointment of officers were perceived throughout the colonial era as a threat to traditional government balances. In June 1689, the rebellious New York militia captains organized a council of war and called for a meeting of delegates from New York and East Jersey counties to oversee the government. In doing so, they followed Dutch political traditions where fundamental law, natural rights, representative institutions, and popular sovereignty were important aspects of the political structure. The resulting convention's election of senior militia captain and wealthy merchant Jacob Leisler as provincial commander-in-chief followed Dutch precedents. When ruling elites in the Netherlands were discredited, their loss of legitimacy caused a demand for change in those holding offices and the restoration of the local corporate rights. Leisler's election as commander-in-chief thus fell within the Dutch tradition of finding a leader to balance the power of the magistrates. Drawing on Dutch populist ideology, Leislerians sought to restore government balances by reclaiming the people's corporate rights, the abolishment of monopolies, demands for no taxation without representation, the right to bear arms unrestricted, and the devolution of authority to the communities. The Republic's political divisions continued to influence New York politics into the 18th century. In the 1720s, mercantile and agrarian interests hardened. One faction, led by the Morris and Livingston families, supported Dutch Reformed and Presbyterian interests, and, known as the Country Party, reflected Orangist ideology. An opposing faction of mostly Anglican mercantile and manorial families, including Delancey, Schuylers, Phillipses, and Van Cortlands, known as the Court Party, reflected the interests of the Dutch regent class. In Dutch fashion, elites with fluent allegiances dominated the factions. The two parties, supplemented by lesser factions, disagreed on economic, constitutional, and religious issues, and the establishment of colleges, today's Columbia University and Rutgers. New Yorkers and Jerseyites clearly saw their political alignments in the terms of those in the Republic. When Robert Livingston called Leislerians butterboxes and bores, or when Leislerians termed their opponents grandees and coxians, they were using commonplace Dutch political labels. Seeing New York's factionalism as an extension of Dutch politics, one Leislerian pamphleteer reflected that the opposition had escaped being dewitted by a sufficiently provoked people, a reference to the brutal 1672 murders of Holland's Raadpensionaris Jan de Witt and his brother Cornelis by an Orangist mob in The Hague. The continuing impact of Dutch events upon American politics is seen in the wake of the Dutch Revolution of 1747, which placed Willem IV of Orange as stadtholder in all 7 provinces. At the time of the Revolution, the Dutch turned out an enormous literature looking back to the traditional balances of good government and the corporate rights of the people. Late historian James Tanis convincingly argues that during the English imperial crisis of the 1740s and 1750s, New Yorkers and Jerseyites also looked to their Dutch traditions. Citing numerous Dutch Reformed and Presbyterian sermons, the Dutch example, he writes, became an important symbol for the colonists at the time of the Albany Congress in 1754. For the population of the middle colonies then, the 16th century Dutch revolt against Spain and the actions of Stadtholder William III during the 1688 Glorious Revolution served as the paradigm of union and independence. As an illustration, during the 1750s, American Dutch language almanacs republished the 1581 Act of Abjuration, by which the Republic had declared its independence from Spain, and the 1579 Union of Utrecht, the Republic's basic federalizing document. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson's 1776 Declaration of Independence so closely follows the Act of Abjuration in construction that some scholars suggest that the act served as Jefferson's model, while the influence of the Dutch Republic's body politic as developed under the Union of Utrecht on the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution has also been long suggested. In addition, out of Dutch party factionalism and special interests emerged the seeds for the development of the modern American political system, introduced by Martin Van Buren, a descendant of the early settlers of Rensselaer, in the creation of New York State and later National Democratic Party organization. For those familiar with Dutch history, to suggest the persistence of Dutch culture in New York and New Jersey seems self-evident. From place and family names to folklore, material culture, and cuisine, the Dutch presence is very much alive in the region today. We have inherited unfettered commerce, freedom of conscience, the concept of toleration, and a republican political culture from the Dutch. The concept of individual liberties protected through corporate rights left a strong tradition in the Mid-Atlantic region and, subsequently, upon the United States national government, as seen in the influence of special interests in the shaping of governmental policies. By examining our common heritage with the Netherlands and exploring how our Dutch colleagues deal with crisis, we can undoubtedly derive more realistic policies in facing the challenges posed by the rising tides of global warming. Thank you.
Would you entertain some questions?
Sure. Inside my hat. Yes.
I guess I'm curious, did the Dutch intermingle, marry only within themselves and say through the 18th century?
No, the Dutch culture was very assimilative. So when we're speaking about a Dutch culture, it's not necessarily an ethnic concept. What did happen is that you found regional cohesiveness. So that, for example, in New Brunswick, there was a whole section of New Brunswick settled by Albany Dutch who kept to themselves, or people from Albany. But in reality, when we talk about New Netherland Dutch, it's a mixture of many different ethnic groups. It's not one single ethnic group.
One other question I made. You mentioned the Mohawk Valley. So how were their relations with the Palatines? Did they?
Well, the Palatines originally were settled on the Hudson River in the Germantown area, and then they moved off into the Mohawk Valley. And their relations were apparently quite good.
Really good, okay.
And still very influential in that whole region. Yes?
How were the relationships with the Native Americans at the time?
Well, under the Dutch, of course, we had a number of very, very severe wars, most notably Kief's War in 1643. And then you had two wars with the Esopus Indians, which was in the Kingston area. Kief's War pretty much saw the extermination of the Indians around Manhattan. And the Esopus Wars forced the Esopus Indians westward. The relationship was good with the Iroquois nations, the Iroquois people, who of course were instrumental in the fur trade. So it's a mix. When people say that New Netherland had great relations with the Native Americans, that's not necessarily true. It depends on the tribe. They're very different.
I have one more question. The houses that were built in the Beverwijk area near Albany,
Right.
They looked very much like the houses all over the country in the Netherlands, but did they build basements?
Well,
of course, the houses in the Netherlands do not have basements.
No.
Nobody does.
And the regional variations. Many of the houses, as you know, when the first settlers, they built the basements first, and they lived in them until they until they could, Weather conditions played a part. When the first settlers came here, it appears that they originally followed a type of housing found mostly in the eastern Netherlands, which is a house barn type. But very quickly, and for unknown reasons, they separated the barn from the main house. This happened within a generation or two. And also, again, the houses that we see today are basically 18th century. There's almost no 17th century houses left. And there is a change in the architecture that is going on, a process that has to deal with the climate, the differences in climate, and there's great regional variations between what you find in New Jersey and, of course, up in the upper Hudson River Valley. Also, you'll find that, for example, where I live up in Columbia County, they're brick. Most of the Dutch houses are brick. Down here, they're stone, I believe. A lot of them are stone or wood. You find, but it's in the internal structure. It's in the H frame that's very noticeable.
And the first slide that we saw was that from the St. Elizabeth
N-
1400?
That's a 1634 flood.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Netherlands had, it was hard to decide which flood that I was going to use. There was,
Oh, okay.
and I just thought that I had, was able to get a better picture. For some reason, my own computer unfortunately died, and there's a whole, there's actually, the slide programs dissolved and everything. For some reason, it's not able to do it on this computer. So there's some of the information got lost on the screen. But and of course the most recent flood was the 1953 flood that overwhelmed the Netherlands. Yes?
One other question I made. When you were mentioning the manors, were all four of them set up by the Dutch?
No, the only one that survived was Rensselaer. And they managed, after a lot of trouble, to get their patent renewed by James. Most of the manors were created in the 1680s by the English. And there's a lot more than just those four. Those four that I mentioned are the most well known. The thing is that what James II was establishing here for his own political reasons, because it also gave them a greater voice in any possible assembly that would be set up, because the manors then would have had their own representation, is that it followed something that was very common in the Netherlands. A system that was really very common. And so it was not unfamiliar to the Dutch. It wasn't an imposition of something they didn't know or understand. And the real problems come when the New Englanders begin to move in the 1760s, and then you begin to get the anti-rent wars going on in the Hudson Valley. That's the start that culminates in the 1840s.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I very much enjoyed it. I learned a great deal. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.